does Europe have what it takes to, I don't know, stand on its own 2 feet, project
Sure.
real power, especially with the world becoming, what's the word, multipolar, right?
Multipolar, yeah.
With the U.S., China, and maybe even a truly unified Europe all vying for influence. So that's our deep dive today. Can Europe hang on to that superpower status, or are we looking at a future where, well, the U.S. and China just leave it in the dust?
I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. So where do we even begin unpacking all of this?
Well, if Europe wants to stay relevant, let alone a superpower, there's some pretty big hurdles to overcome.
Okay, like what specifically?
Well, first and foremost, it's got to get its act together, be more unified, especially when it comes to defense. Historically, Europe has, well, it's leaned pretty heavily on the US for security.
That security umbrella we were talking about.
Exactly, but like we said, that's not looking so dependable anymore, and that's why you're hearing more and more people talking about a European army, a real one. And not just that, military budgets across Europe, they're going up, and there are these, well, increasingly loud calls for deeper federalization within the EU.
Hmm.
The thinking is, if Europe wants to throw its weight around on the world stage, it's got to act like a single, unified force.
Okay, I get that. But being more unified like that, it's easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. You've got 27 member states in the EU, each with their own interests, their own histories, their own, well, everything.
Right, and I remember reading that for anything really big to happen, like changing treaties or setting overall defense policy, every single country has to agree. Unanimous consent, they call it.
Hmm.
And that just seems like a recipe for, well, getting stuck.
It can be, yeah. Especially with those Eurosceptic governments, the ones who aren't so keen on handing more power to the EU.
And let's not forget, there's always the possibility of some, shall we say, outside influence, pushing certain countries to block things.
Right, external actors playing their own games, trying to keep Europe divided.
It's a tricky situation, no doubt about it.
It really is. But look, the political landscape in Europe, it's not set in stone. Things change, governments come and go, public opinion shifts. You never know what the future holds.
Sure enough.
And on top of that, the EU does have some tools to work around those vetoes, if things get really dire. Article 7 of the treaty, for instance, it's rarely used, but it's there.
Okay, so even with all that gridlock, there's still, I guess you could say, a glimmer of hope for deeper integration.
Yeah, I'd say so. But even if Europe does manage to get on the same page, there's the whole question of, well, paying for all this, building up a serious European defense force. That's going to take a whole lot of money.
Absolutely. And I've seen some proposals floating around about, maybe the EU should start borrowing money together for defense spending.
Yeah, that idea of joint borrowing, it's gaining traction. And some even suggest it should be funded by, get this, an EU-wide tax. Now, that would be a pretty big step towards a more, I guess you could say, federalized Europe.
It would, but it's not totally unprecedented, right? I mean, look at the euro. Plenty of people were skeptical about that back in the day, but it happened.
Right. The euro is a perfect example of how, well, sometimes those big, scary changes can actually work out, and the same logic could apply here. Joint borrowing for defense, it could create a stronger financial bond between EU countries, even the ones that are hesitant about giving up more power. It's kind of like, well, if you're in debt together, you're more likely to work together to get out of it.
Makes sense. So we've talked about unity, but even with all the best intentions, there's the practical matter of, well, does Europe even have the industrial muscle to build the kind of military it needs? I mean, collectively, Europe has a huge GDP, but it seems like its defense industry is, well, a bit of a mess.
It's fragmented, yeah, that's one way to put it. Lots of different companies, different countries, all doing their own thing. And on top of that, Europe is still pretty reliant on U.S. contractors for a lot of its military hardware.
Which, if things go sour across the Atlantic, could be a real problem.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine if the U.S. decides, for whatever reason, that it doesn't want to supply Europe with weapons anymore. That would leave Europe in a pretty precarious position.
So what's the solution then? How does Europe break free from that dependence?
Well, there are a few ideas being tossed around. One is this big European defense fund, a pot of money specifically for boosting European defense companies.
Okay, so pumping money into the industry.
Right, but it's not just about throwing money at the problem. There's also talk about, encouraging more joint procurement, where different countries buy weapons together, bulk orders, and more collaboration on research and development so European companies can, catch up to the U.S. technologically.
So basically, building a more cohesive and competitive European defense industry.
Exactly. It's about getting all those different companies, different countries to work together instead of against each other. And in the long run, that could lead to a more efficient, more innovative European defense sector, one that doesn't have to rely so much on the US.
It's interesting you mentioned this idea of, different countries working together. And one thing that came up in the research was this potential for, well, repurposing existing industrial capacity for defense.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know, converting car factories into tank factories or something.
Yeah, that's an intriguing idea, isn't it? Kind of like what happened during World War II, when car factories were churning out tanks and planes. And actually, it's not as far-fetched as it might sound.
Okay.
Yeah, the car industry in Europe, it's facing some serious headwinds these days. With the shift to electric vehicles and all that, a lot of those traditional car plants, they're struggling. So some folks are saying, hey, why not convert those factories, retrain those workers, and put them to work building, military hardware instead?
Oh, that's actually a pretty clever idea.
It is. I mean, think about it. You've got this skilled workforce, these huge factories just sitting there. It's a potential gold mine for boosting defense production, and it could help those struggling regions, too.
That's a good point. So we've got unity, we've got the industrial base, but there's one more big piece of the puzzle we haven't talked about yet, and that's nuclear weapons.
Ah, yes, the nuclear question. It's a sensitive one, but it's one that Europe can't ignore if it's serious about being a superpower.
Right. And it seems like the traditional thinking about nuclear deterrence in Europe, it's changing.
It is. For decades, Europe has basically relied on the U.S. nuclear umbrella for protection. The idea being that, well, if anyone messes with Europe, the U.S. will retaliate with nukes. But like we said before, that guarantee, it's not looking so solid anymore.
And that's why you're seeing this talk about, maybe France should step up and extend its nuclear umbrella to cover more of Europe.
Right. France being the only EU country with its own nuclear arsenal. And even more drastically, some countries are actually starting to whisper about, well, maybe they need to develop their own nukes.
Wow, their own nukes. That's a pretty big deal.
It is. It would be a huge shift for Europe, and it would have massive implications for global security. But it just goes to show how seriously some European countries are taking this idea of, being responsible for their own security.
Okay, so we've talked about the military side of things, but obviously being a superpower isn't just about tanks and bombs. It's about economic strength, too.
Absolutely. You can't project power on the world stage if your economy is sputtering. And, well, let's just say that Europe has some work to do on that front.
Yeah, the research paints a bit of a mixed picture. On the one hand, Europe's got a massive combined GDP, but on the other hand, there's this growing gap between Europe and the U.S., and Europe's productivity growth has been lagging for a while now.
Right. And a lot of folks are pointing to this so-called innovation gap as a major concern. Europe just hasn't been as successful as the US, or even China for that matter, when it comes to, creating those big tech companies, attracting venture capital, all that.
So how does Europe close that gap? What needs to change?
Well, there's a big push for more investment in research and development, both
Yeah.
from governments and from the private sector. Some people are even talking about setting up something like DARPA in Europe, that US agency that funds all those cutting edge technologies. And then there's the whole regulatory side of things. Europe's got this single market, which is great in theory, but in practice, it can be a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare. So there's a lot of talk about, streamlining regulations, making it easier for businesses to operate across borders, all that good stuff.
Okay, so boosting innovation, making the single market work better. But it's not just about playing catch up, right? There's also this whole green technology revolution happening.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge opportunity for Europe. I mean, think about it.
I know.
Leading the way in green technologies, that could give Europe a real edge, both economically and politically. It's about, not just being a superpower in the old sense, but being a superpower in the new sustainable sense.
I like the way you put that.
Yeah.
But even with all these plans, all these ambitions, there's still this nagging question of, well, can Europe actually get its act together?
It's the big question mark hanging over everything, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Because even if Europe solves all these external challenges, all these economic and military issues, it still has to deal with itself.
Right. The internal divisions, the different national interests, the whole complicated machinery of the EU.
And the sources we've been looking at, they're full of examples of, well, how those divisions have played out in real life. Like different countries reacting in totally different ways to international crises. It's almost like they're not even on the same team sometimes.
Yeah, it's pretty stark when you see it laid out like that. And it all comes back to that issue we talked about before, the need for deeper unity. Because if Europe can't even agree on how to respond to a crisis, how can it possibly hope to act as a coherent, decisive global power?
So how do we solve that then? Is deeper unity even a realistic goal for Europe? Or is it just, well, a pipe dream?
It's a tough one, no doubt about it. I mean, you've got all these different countries, different languages, different cultures, all with their own long histories. It's not like the US where everyone's, relatively new to the game and kind of shares the same basic values. Europe's a lot more complicated than that.
That's for sure.
But that doesn't mean deeper unity is impossible. I mean, look how far Europe has come since World War II. Back then, the idea of a unified Europe, it would have sounded like pure fantasy. But here we are with the EU, the euro, all that.
So you're saying it's not impossible, it's just, well, incredibly difficult.
Exactly. And it's going to take a lot of hard work, a lot of compromise, and a lot of, well, frankly, luck.
So to circle back to where we started, Europe's future as a global power, it's really up in the air.
I'd say that's a fair assessment.
There's this potential there, this underlying strength, but there are also these huge challenges, both internal and external. And it feels like we're at this, well, this tipping point. The world is changing, the old order is breaking down, and Europe has to decide what role it wants to play in the new world order.
That's a great way to put it, a tipping point. And I think what happens next, it depends on a lot of factors. How does the war in Ukraine play out? Does the U.S. really retreat from its global commitments? Can Europe overcome its internal divisions? There's so many unknowns, so many moving parts.
It's enough to make your head spin. But I guess that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating, right? It's this complex, high-stakes drama, and we're all watching to see how it unfolds.
It's a drama with some pretty big implications for all of us, no matter where we live. And as we wrap things up here, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. If Europe does manage to get its act together, if it can become a truly unified and powerful force on the world stage, what kind of superpower will it be? Will it be a superpower that emphasizes cooperation and diplomacy? A superpower that leads the way on green technology and sustainability? Or will it be a superpower that, well, that falls into the same old traps of military competition and global dominance? I think that's the question we all need to be thinking about as we watch Europe navigate this uncertain future.
Food for thought indeed. It's been a great discussion, and thanks to everyone for listening to our deep dive today.